on to the next. Now, look, basically your best suburbs in Australia generally grow somewhere between 7 and 10%, and yield will generally only do 3 to 4% in the long term. Now, that means it obviously can't keep up with capital growth. Yield will not keep up with it in your best suburbs. Now, look, this is what's going to happen basically in a suburb like that. Now, in essence, what will happen is in these sorts of suburbs, you'll have capital growth going like this, and then yield slowly sliding down like that. Now, the reason for that is because clearly in the numbers, 7 to 10% clearly outdoes 3 to 4%. So you've got growth going higher than yield, so yield slowly slides down. So that's actually the best result. Now, people will often say you need both, and without a doubt, 100% true. But the issue you're going to have is that won't continue the long term in these very poor performing suburbs. Now, if it did, if yield was to do 7 to 10% like capital growth over, let's say, the last 30 or 40 years, you'd have houses leasing for over $3,000 in Australia, which just isn't the case. The average rent, I think, in Australia is something around $650 a week, or maybe $700. I don't know the exact number, but it's something like that. It's definitely not $3,000 a week. So don't believe that rubbish rhetoric. It's just not the truth. Now, let's just go into a little bit more here. A key part that everyone seems to get wrong as well here in property is that it's not actually solely actual yield you want, it's actual serviceable equity, not necessarily cash flow. And the reason why for this is because serviceable equity comes from the equity gained from the growth of property over the course of time. Now, you require both ideally, though without good growth, all you're doing is simply pricing yourself out of better suburbs. Now, it's hard for a lot of people, without question. It is very hard to understand this, and it's actually not a fair market at all, to be fair. But the thing you need to understand is that it's actually the system we actually operate in is called capitalism. It's not incomeism. Now, look, a deposit in Australia at the time of actually recording this video is roughly, for average in Australia, you need roughly $120,000 to $140,000. Now, if you look at that there, the average time it would take to save, just in general, is nearly 6 years. Now, if you look at basically something from the perspective of saving, let's say, even $100,000 to break into one of the cheaper performing, better suburbs. Now, most people, I'd say, would argue that would take at least 5 years. Some might argue 7. Now, if you can get into the market and get into the right suburb, what is going to happen is over the course of time, you're going to have basically the equity build up in your property, which will make you $100,000. Now, making $100,000 is way easier than saving $100,000. Now, 20% growth in, let's say, 2 to 4 years for a suburb that's, let's say, $500,000 isn't like uncommon, especially if you know where to buy and what to buy. And that would equate to roughly $100,000 in equity. Now, in the right suburbs, you might have periods of, slowness for a couple of years in both capital growth and rental growth. Though these, the fact of the matter is, they do revert to generally their long-term averages, and you'll generally get both over the long term, which then will help fund future deposits for more properties, and it'll keep you in the market for those better suburbs. If you're buying a suburb that's doing 4% compared to a suburb that's doing 8%, you're just continually pricing yourself out of a better suburb. It's just as simple as that. Now, furthermore, look, I'm actually going to go into an exact example now. Now, this is just unbelievable because I'm going to give a really real life scenario here, and I'm actually going against almost every buyer's agent in the country, and in saying a suburb in Townsville. So the suburb I've used is Heatley because there's a lot of data there, and it's quite consistent. It's not your cheapest suburb in Townsville either. So I'm not trying to just nitpick your cheapest suburb just to basically make myself look good. I'm actually picking a suburb where it makes complete sense and I can contrast it. So, and I'm comparing that to somewhere like Footscray in Melbourne, which every single person in the country will say don't buy in Melbourne because it has very poor governance, which I do not disagree with. However, it is
also one of the best places to invest your money in Australia at the moment. And not only that, it long-term just performs exceptionally well. So let's have a look. This is an actual example, and this is publicly available information, so I'm not making this up. This is from Domain. In the 80s and 90s of both Footscray and Heatley. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see Footscray, and on the left-hand side, you'll see Heatley. Now, they're actually very similar in price, if not even, you could probably even argue that Heatley is actually a little bit more expensive in this time compared to Footscray. Now, you know, go and call someone up who lives in Heatley or property manager, especially if they've been there for more than 30 years, and ask them if they're happy that they bought in Heatley or they're happy they bought in Footscray. I guarantee you they're going to be very unhappy to say that I didn't buy somewhere like Footscray, I want a better suburb. Now, the issue is that people will push these suburbs because in the short term it's very easy to actually make predictions about where things are going to go. You only actually need probably about 10 or so key factors to be going your way. But the fact of the matter is, it might grow 20 to 40% in 2 to 3 years, but if it does nothing for the next 15, you're actually losing money longer term. And look, if you had bought one house in Footscray, let's say 30 years ago, you could literally just on equity buy probably 3 Heatley houses outright, maybe even more if you wanted to actually service them for actually just getting a loan purpose. But anyway, aside from that, let's go to a few graphs just to prove it even further. Now, here's your actual average prices in Footscray at the moment. So you can see as of the moment, we're almost at the $1 million mark. Now, let's compare this to somewhere like Heatley, where you can see it's been about, that's 14 years, and we've grown somewhere from about, let's say, 330, 350,000 to about $400,000 today. Now, this is just ridiculous, and I don't know how a logical person could say that this is a good purchase. Now, this is probably going to go to $500,000, don't get me wrong, over the next probably 2 years or so, no doubt. Somewhere like that, maybe, and you probably will make money, no doubt. But for someone that's not, for example, on their retirement plan for the next 2 to 5 years, I don't know why the hell you'd buy here in this. And I'll even make this worse for people who want to buy there. Somewhere like Heatley, I think this is, sorry, this is Footscray. This is the rent in Footscray. So in 2010, you would have got about $400 a week in rent. Now you're getting somewhere between $650 and $700 a week in rent. You can see fairly consistent growth. A bit of a slow period, obviously, in that COVID period, no doubt because of what happened in Melbourne. But you can see the trend is fairly up in the market here. Let's go to Heatley. You've had rent obviously a little bit lower here of $330 to $350 a week to start with, and now it's closing in on sort of $470 to $500 a week. Now, that's not actually, if we go back, they're not far off there, but you got to remember, back in the time of where I first contrasted in the 80s and 90s, you probably had very similar rent in both of them as well. Now, imagine you had, let's say, $150 a week less cash flow in one market compared to another. Well, it's probably even a little bit more, and I'm just being modest there. Now, it's just ridiculous, like, looking at this, and in longer term, this is just going to continue. Like, this rent will probably go to $550 a week, then go silent for another 10 years or so, whereas Footscray might go silent for, let's say, somewhere like, it could go silent for 2 to 4 years, but then it's just going to continue back to its normal 3 to 4% averages of rental increases, right? Now, how irresponsible is it for someone to actually recommend a suburb like this saying you've got long-term growth? Because it's just not the case. Now, anyway, aside from that, I think that explains it enough in detail as to why capital growth is so much more important than something like just simply cash flow, because the numbers just don't stack up long term. And somewhere like Heatley will go back to its average of 4 to 5%. Footscray to 8.5 to 10%. So there you go. There's a free suburb, everyone. Thank me later.
Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to this channel, and if you're looking to purchase a property in Australia's best performing suburbs, be sure to reach out via www.compoundinvest.com.au. The details are below. Thanks again, and welcome to the channel. I'll see you on the next one.